Hi all. So now we are going to look at the analysis of the prologue in House Made of Dawn. It'll talk about the ceremonial entry and the cultural significance. So here's an overview of a ceremonial entry. There's a conventional introduction. It focuses on plot and character. There's linear narrative structure. There is direct exposition of setting. And now what is the ceremonial entry that we're talking about? This ceremonial entry is rooted in Native American worldviews and it establishes the spiritual landscape. And this is what sets the tone for themes of identity and land. So the prologue is not a conventional introduction to plot or character. Instead, it is a ceremonial entry into the world of the novel. That's what he says, and that's the ceremonial entry. So we see that the dawn is a sacred symbol and it represents rebirth in Native American ceremonies. It also symbolizes purification and new beginnings. And it is normally, there is an interconnected identity. That is to say, the human beings are tied to the land, or rather the human identity is tied to the land. And the land is alive. It's watching. It's also remembering. There's a huge stone that bears witness to all that had happened so far. And besides all of these things, there's spiritual healing that takes place through the house made of dawn. And this is a kind of a reference to Navajo's ceremonial chant. So this suggests spiritual harmony and restoration. And Mamaday uses a kind of a rich rhythmic descriptions of landscape, and he seems to have deep reverence for the natural world. Now, dawn in Native Americans, as we saw earlier, is rebirth and purification of the spirit. It also highlights upon new beginnings and fresh starts. It also focuses upon sacred transition between night and day. That has to be remembered. And it connects the physical world with the spiritual world. And talking about the Navajo ceremonial connection, because we see that the house made of dawn itself is a kind of a chant. And there is a reference to the Navajo ceremonial chant saying house made of dawn, and it's a sacred healing ritual. It's a spiritual healing. So it represents spiritual restoration and harmony. And in Navajo tradition, we are all aware of this hozo concept that highlights upon maintaining harmony between humans and the natural world. The title itself suggests connection to healing and spiritual renewal. So, the landscape in the novel is not passive, it is alive, watching, remembering, and participating in human life. So, now here we find in the prologue that Abel is a ceremonial runner, and this ceremonial runner concept is culturally rooted, and Abel represents cultural connection through ritual running, embodying Pueblo traditions of discipline and spiritual strength. Now there is a kind of a spiritual alignment that takes place between the ceremonial run, and so the ceremonial run symbolizes Abel's connection to spiritual forces and his role as a bridge between physical and spiritual worlds. This running is a cyclical one. It foreshadows the novel's structure, which is cyclical in structure. So Abel will eventually return to this ritual after losing and regaining his identity. The novel begins with Abel's running and it ends with the running. So running is a tradition in Pueblo culture that is linked to discipline, endurance, spiritual strength, and connection to the earth. So the run functions as a metaphor for life. So the struggle for balance, rhythm, and purpose are highlighted. So running is not just an event, it's a cultural metaphor. It has cultural significance. Talking about, as we saw earlier, it's discipline. So Pueblo traditions emphasize on self-control. So running helps them in controlling themselves. It is also associated with endurance. That is to say, the physical strength is tied to spiritual resilience, and it highlights upon the spiritual strength. So it talks about the connection to earth and their ancestors. So that is how running is culturally significant. And there are ties to identity also. So in Pueblo culture, the runner stands for cultural knowledge and spiritual courage. So the run is a metaphor for life struggles and purpose. So you find, this is how the novel moves on. You find that there is a running in the beginning, then there's a recovery, there's a return, there's a loss, and again it ends with the running. So it foreshadows Abel's journey. Abel will return to this ritual. There's loss and regaining of identity, but this cyclical nature or structure mirrors Native American time. So there is a ceremonial tone and oral tradition also. The prologue's poetic chant-like rhythm reflects oral storytelling traditions. Mamaday intentionally blends prose with the style of indigenous ceremonial speech. And he creates a poetic rhythm through this chant-like quality that echoes the indigenous ceremonial speech, patterns, and spiritual expressions. The stories are recited, sung, and embodied rather than simply written, making the novel a ceremonial text. We should understand that. So the novel itself has a performative function. Okay, so like their songs that are performed, Mamaday makes his novel perform, and he elevates Abel's journey into a mythic pattern of loss and return, connecting personal experience to universal cycles. So there is a mythic pattern, and he draws the readers into a spiritual and cultural world where storytelling and ceremony are intertwined. So here is a pictorial representation of it. The written and the spoken patterns make it a ceremony of performance. So the story is a performance. We understand that stories in indigenous cultures are performative because they are recited, sung, embodied, and they are not just written. So whereas the written narrative is a static text on a page, rather an oral one is a dynamic one. In the written narrative, the author has control over the meaning, and the reader consumes it. But in the oral tradition, you don't have a single author. It is anonymous. Okay, and there are so many authors. In certain aspects, it's the community that's the author. So it becomes a performative story. You have the living words spoken or sung. The community seems to be participating in it. It's emotional and spiritual resonance. So the prologue elevates Abel's journey into a mythic pattern of renewal and restoration. So let's look at this cyclical time versus linear time. The Western time is the linear time, beginning, middle, end, and conclusion. The Native American time is the cyclic time. So the Western time progresses in a straight line from past to future, and it emphasizes on cause and effect relationships, and it views time as a resource that has to be managed. But in the Native American, it's a cyclic time, and it expands outward from the sacred moment, that's the dawn, and it connects present with the ancestral memory, and thus it emphasizes cycle, repetition, and renewal. Now, time and the narrative structure. The cyclical time and the narrative. The Native American time is emphasizes cycles, and so not the Western linear progression, and that is what Mamaday does in his novel. Abel's story is part of a larger pattern and not an isolated one. The novel structure reflects indigenous temporal patterns, and this cyclical time aligns with the themes of return and restoration. So the prologue moves in slow, circular motion rather than chronological progression. So you see beginning, journey, challenge, and return. So this is the journey of Abel. and there is a foreshadowing of alienation. There are subtle hints of future disintegration, harsh world description. The prologue presents a beautiful but a harsh world, telling us about Abel's difficult journey. And the ceremonial run is also described as overwhelming, foreshadowing, and Abel's bodily struggles with violence and injury are also picturized here. Then there is an emphasis on physical endurance that foreshadows Abel's later struggles with alcoholism and bodily weakness. Now, this foreshadowing technique that is presented in the prologue as an image of wholeness that Abel will lose, creating contrast for his later suffering. So, this contrast makes his later suffering all the more tragic, and his eventual healing is more meaningful. So the harmony of the prologue contrasts with Abel's future fragmentation. Now, identity and the body. According to the Pueblo culture, the runner, as we saw earlier, embodies cultural knowledge and spiritual courage that he internalizes. Now, Abel's journey in the beginning has physical and spiritual belonging, but later it becomes a bodily failure and he feels dislocated also. There's a cultural inscription, that is, the body is considered to be a site of cultural identity. Please note, the body is considered to be a site of cultural identity, and this identity is written, it's erased, and it is rewritten in the case of Abel, the protagonist. So the act of running is tied to the body's identity. In Pueblo culture, the runner stands for cultural knowledge, discipline, and spiritual courage. And so the prologue establishes the body as a site of cultural inscription where identity is written, erased, and rewritten. So now the physical and spiritual belonging. In the beginning, there's a kind of a physical harmony. Abel belongs physically and spiritually to the place where he is, to his community, to his family, to his people, to his beloved people and all that. And the runner represents his communal knowledge, discipline, and spiritual courage. So there is physical discipline, spiritual alignment, cultural connection, all of that is there in the beginning. But eventually we find that his body fails when he is in Los Angeles. He is drunk, weak, and he is bet or he is beaten up by people. So the cultural inscription that had been formed or encrypted upon are erased because of the bodily failure, spiritual disconnection, and cultural erasure. So cultural erasure takes place very consciously. So this is what happens. Again, the body is a site of cultural inscription. Now you find that there are mythic and archetypal patterns also here in this novel. Mamaday positions Abel as both a specific individual and a representative figure of indigenous experience. So we find him as an individual hero first. When we look at him as an individual hero, we find him as a person with specific character, with personal journey, with experiences of loss and disconnection, and as a person who has knowledge about his own community, about his own identity, and who associates himself with his native tradition and all that. But he is also seen as a collective experience. He represents indigenous experiences under colonization. That is very important, please note. And he symbolizes cultural displacement and adaptation. And he connects individual to ancestral traditions. So this archetypal pattern, we find that the young man is running at dawn mirrors initiation rituals, while natural elements act as silent witnesses to a timeless Native American journey. So now let's look at the initiation and natural witnesses. So dawn running is a kind of an initiation ceremony. He is running at dawn, mirroring traditional initiation rituals. The sun awakens with Abel, symbolizing rebirth in Native American ceremonies. And what about the sky? It observes silently. So thus it represents the connection between earth and the spirit. And the earth, it provides foundation and endurance for spiritual journeys. So, there is an archetypal significance. Mamaday positions Abel as both a specific individual and a representative figure of indigenous experience under colonization, establishing him as an archetype of the Native American hero who is lost in the modern world. Now, let's look at the structure of the return. It's a circular structure as we have seen earlier. The prologue creates a circular narrative framework that reappears symbolically at the end of the novel. There's a harmony. It establishes the ideal state, harmony with tradition and community. And it also stresses upon the fragmentation. In the middle of the novel, you get to know about Abel's fall from grace and disconnection from cultural roots. Then there is this restoration that happens. The end shows return to tradition and healing through ceremonial practices. So, what are the interpretative keys to the novel? The prologue serves as a spiritual map establishing the framework for understanding the novel's movement and thematic development. So, you find that there is this narrative framework that frames the novel as a journey from wholeness to fragmentation and back to restoration, and thus creating, when we say restoration, it is return to tradition. When I say fragmentation, it's alienation, and wholeness, cultural alignment, and thus it creates a kind of a cyclical understanding of Abel's journey. It also reflects the indigenous worldviews of cyclic time, suggesting that Abel's story is part of a larger pattern of loss and return, not just his, but a larger pattern of loss and return. And the sacred landscape establishes the natural world as a character, highlighting the interconnectedness between human identity and the land. Then there is a kind of a ceremonial tone, and that ceremonial tone sets a spiritual register. Register here is the linguistic term, a spiritual register that prepares readers to encounter themes of renewal, suffering, and restoration throughout the novel. So the prologue is both a poetic invocation and a spiritual map for understanding the novel. Now, what are the essential functions? As we said, again, it's a summary of the essentials: sacred landscape, cultural alignment, foreshadowing, and cyclical time. So, thank you, dear friends, for watching this. Thank you for your patient watching.